Hello and welcome everyone to the Living New Deal webinar series. My name is Bridget Boyle and I'm going to be your technical assistant today. Wanted to just let you know how this is going to go. There's going to be some talking, a PowerPoint presentation, and then a Q&A section and discussion, of course. And if you're wanting to ask any questions, we ask that you use the Q&A function in Zoom. So if you're looking at the bottom of your screen, you should see a little Q&A thing and you can throw your question in there. That way we can track them easily. If you can't find that for some reason, you can ask questions in the chat, but we prefer the Q&A. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm going to bring on Susan Ives at this point. Oops. Sorry, Susan, you're muted.
There we go. Sorry, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Living New Deal webinar, The New Deal Artistry of Joe Mora. I'm Susan Ives. The Living New Deal is a nonprofit organization in Berkeley, California, that's popularizing the idea of a New Deal. The Living New Deal was founded at UC Berkeley about a dozen years ago. Our mission is to preserve the New Deal's legacy nationwide, make people aware of what the New Deal was and did, and to promote the New Deal as a model for government today. We are documenting all that the New Deal built to an interactive, searchable map that locates post offices, parks, schools, roads, city halls, public art, and more. This archive of the New Deal's achievements nationwide can be found at livingnewdeal.org. We hope you'll sign up to receive our newsletter and invitations to special events and programs like this. This webinar series, The Art of the New Deal, explores the many and diverse cultural arts programs the New Deal made possible and what a New Deal for the arts could do today. Our guest tonight, Peter Hiller, will be discussing the artist Joe Mora, whose commissions for the Federal Art Project reflect the spirit of the New Deal, making art and beauty available to every American. As we'll learn, Mora applied his prodigious talents to democratizing art through his ambitious and exquisite installations at New Deal buildings throughout California. Peter is the Joe Mora Collection Curator and the author of The Life and Times of Joe Mora, iconic artist of the American West. Peter will be joined by New Deal historian and author Harvey Smith, project advisor to the Living New Deal. You can join the conversation by writing questions into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Thank you so much for your interest and for tuning in tonight. We hope you will enjoy the program and join us at upcoming monthly webinars on New Deal art and artists. Your donations make our work and programs like this available to everyone free of charge. We welcome your support. And we welcome and thank you, Peter Hiller and Harvey Smith.
Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Hiller, and it is my pleasure to be here with you today. The New Deal has a warm spot in my heart, not only based on the accomplishments of Joe Mora, but just in general as a concept and an entity. In fact, I discovered a sidewalk in Phoenix, Arizona that was done during the WPA and was the first one to list it on the WPA site. So it's something that I enjoy tracking all of the time. Joe Mora was born in Uruguay, and I want to check to make sure that you're seeing these images. He was born to an outstanding family. He had a wonderful mother and father, each of whom loved him. They raised Joe and his older brother, Luis. There was art in the family. Joe's father was a classical sculptor. His brother was a classical painter. And it served Joe in a wonderful way. He did do some training in art school, but I would go so far as to say that his father was his most important artistic influence. The family moved to the East Coast of the United States when Joe was quite young, and that's where he grew up before he came west. What I want to do tonight is give you a brief overview of his career, very brief, and then spend most of our time in the PowerPoint on his 2 WPA projects. His career started out as an illustrator. He worked for the Boston Herald, illustrating news events in the newspaper. He also then worked as a book illustrator for several different publishers on the East Coast. So you're going to see several examples of the different aspects of his life. He would go on to do a column for them called Animaldom, in which this was a full-page comic that appeared in the Sunday newspaper. He did not only the illustrations, but he also wrote the limericks that went along with them. So we have an illustrator, we have an artist, we have also a writer. He would go on to paint, not as much as some other mediums that he worked in, but it gives you a sense of how he was able to work in so many different mediums. And these are murals that were initially located in a hotel in San Francisco, the Drake Wiltshire. They're now currently on display in Pacific Grove, California. You could consider him a graphic designer, as he did the work here on the menus for the hotel in a very animated fashion. Animals were a continual theme in his work throughout his career. And he was a sculptor. He inherited that fascination from his father, and he also inherited the skills to pursue it, I think, from working with his father. This is him watching the installation of a piece in Carmel, California, that is still there to this day.
Hi, Peter. Sorry to interrupt you, but we're having a little bit of issues with the image. Somebody's saying to use the fit to screen feature to see the images. Do you have that on your PowerPoint?
I am not seeing that because I'm not seeing the bar of my PowerPoint. Sorry.
I see. Okay. Maybe can you scroll back one and then forward again?
And there seems to be a little bit of a lag.
Why don't we go ahead and stop the share and restart it? Thank you.
Okay, let's. How's that?
Now you have to start the share again, the screen share.
Oh, okay. Just a second.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, apologize for this.
Moment. Okay, now hit play from start. Great, and then scroll forward. That should hopefully fixed it. Yeah.
Is that working?
Yeah, that's working.
Okay, there we go. Okay, and I'm sorry. I apologize for that. We missed this, which also is an indication of his work as a painter. In this case, working in gouache. And then again, back to his cartooning work on different scales, including his graphic design work, sculptural work. And then we get to 2 pieces of which he's probably most well known. He was a cartographer, and his work fits into the pictorial map category, of which these are 2 examples. And this is kind of key to the full story of the work during the Depression. He started doing these maps in the late 20s and into the early 30s, and at the encouragement of his son Joey, Joe had two children, a daughter Patty and a son Joe Jr. He started creating maps, and Joey, who was in many ways his father's business manager, would take these maps out to various places, gift stores, trading posts in the Southwest, different venues where they could be sold. And it ended up keeping a little bit, enough of a cash flow for the family that they were able to get through the Depression through the sales of these carts. And so you can imagine back in the day, they would have cost 50 cents, and that would have been, you know, cumulatively enough to help keep food on the table and clothing on everybody's backs and a roof over their head. And Joe was, he never had any other source of income other than through his artwork. So this came at a critical time in his career. And because these were paper items, ephemeral material, they were printed in, you know, probably 1,000 at a time. And so consequently, they are more far-reaching, or the most far-reaching art of Joe's in terms of people's familiarity with Joe Mora and who he was. And oftentimes they will recognize a card of his and not realize that he was also the painter we saw, he was the writer we saw, he was the sculptor we saw. But those all contributed to him and were added up to what made him so fascinating as far as being an artist was concerned. I'm going to go back one. Okay, here we go. Now we're getting to the WPA. And there are two buildings that Joe worked on during that period of time in the 30s. And the first one was the Monterey County Courthouse. And this slide tells volumes about the process. So if you look at this center portion of the picture, that was the existing courthouse in the mid-1930s in Salinas, California. It was the Monterey County Courthouse in sort of a Queen Anne Victorian style architecture. And the task of creating the new building fell to architect Robert Stanton. And Robert Stanton was, I would say, I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. Robert Stanton was in mid-career as an architect. He did public buildings, he did private residences in the Monterey County area. And his challenge was to create a building that would take the county into the future in terms of its size and its scale. And yet, during the time that the building was under construction, court had to stay in session. So Robert Stanton's concept for the building was to literally build the new building around the existing building, which stayed in operation. Once the new building was finished, which you can see from the area where the flat tops are, the flat roofs, they literally opened the windows, passed the furniture from the old building into the new building, and court didn't miss a beat. So it's just an amazing story. What they couldn't pass through the windows into the new offices, they were able to pass through the columns that Stanton had designed on the north and the south sides of the building. And then this photograph is taken from the interior courtyard area, which is the footprint of the original building. And it looks largely the same today as it did then. And one of the components of the buildings that were created under the work progress, and particularly the public PWA work, was that it needed to have, it was required to have an artistic component to it. So that's where Joe and Robert Stanton ended up working together. They were actually neighbors of each other in the Pebble Beach area on the Monterey Peninsula. So they knew of each other, they knew each other's families, and Stanton knew of Joe's reputation. Joe had done numerous other decorative elements on buildings that still exist in San Francisco. There's some in Los Angeles. So that Joe's reputation preceded him, and it was a very easy match for the two of them to work together. And what I want to do is call your attention to some of the different elements that you can see from this particular picture. So near the top, you see the column caps, and those were four-sided actually, with a different image on each side. If you go down the columns about 2/3 of the way, you will see most clearly, you see three panels, bas-relief panels that are up against the building. We'll look at those more carefully. The center area was a fountain, and that's the column that you see surrounded by the bird of paradise. And then if you look off to the right, you will see three heads that are on the building, and we will look at those as well. So here are our heroes, Joe Mora on the right, Robert Stanton on the left, and close enough during the actual execution of one of the column caps for you to see the style and the detail of the work that went into those. And Joe Mora loved history, and he particularly loved the history of California. And so each of those segments of the building that I showed you reflect either the history of California or the history of Monterey County. And Joe repeated the themes, but he did not repeat the images in the same way. So it's really kind of amazing it's just a wonderful tribute to sort of brainstorming, where you have an idea and you depict that idea in numerous different ways. Here's an example, another photograph of some of the other column caps. You can see that they trace the history of California from the indigenous people, and eventually, if you follow them around, they end up being what would have been called modern times at that point. Also want to bring to your attention the piece that's in the sort of the lower left, where you see the bison heads and then an octopus design. So it was multifaceted in terms of the themes and the iconography of the work. This is one of the bas-relief panels that Joe did. There were 5 different ones, and they each depicted an era of California history. And then here we have him in his studio, which was in Pebble Beach. And you can see Joe himself is working on another one of those bas-relief pieces. And you can see to his left is the one that we just looked at when it was finished. And also in this picture are murals at work. His studio was a beehive of activity, with numerous projects going on at the same time, depending on which commissions came his way and at what time. And so that's the finished piece that we saw him working on. This would have been Settling of the West. And then here, this would have been considered Modern Times. And the only, Joe described his depiction of justice, the figure of justice, as being the only item on the building that was fictitious. Everything else had a real base in reality and in history. And this is the piece that he settled on for the east side of the building above that entrance. And you can see it's kind of interesting to look at the blueprints from the project that are on one picture on the left and see how it changed so much from that to the figure that's on the right. And the next picture, oh, it's doing it again. Huh. There we go. This is the east entrance, and there is that figure above the door. And then now we're moving into the courtyard. And in the upper third is an example of what would have been, or what was to become, one of the heads. And I want to call your attention to the doors below that, and particularly to the panels at the bottom of the doors, because we're going to look at those in just a moment. There were about 25 different heads around the building. They did repeat, and they started again from the indigenous community to modern times. And some of those heads were archetypal, others were actually specific people. And then these are two of the 4 bronze plaques that were down at the bottom where the doors were that I mentioned before. In this case, depicting the agriculture, the economy, the arts on the right. Here are the other 2. There were 4 different pieces of these bronze plaques that were in place, fishing industry. So again, very common themes for the WPA in terms of, sort of celebrating industry and trying to get an economy going again, and, what could people do in order to accomplish that. And I also want you to keep these in mind later for the second building that Joe worked on. And here we have 2 examples of the heads. This would have been Pioneer Woman and Pioneer Man. And somebody was smart enough to create some extra heads in case something happened to them. So these are in storage with Monterey County to this day. And probably the least noticed part of Joe's work were these 4 plaques that were only about 1/16 of an inch thick, but they were decorative elements on the building's elevator doors. So it's the only part of his work that he did that was actually in the interior of the building. Everything else was on the exterior. But these were saved during a recent remodel of the building. These were saved and are on display now. And here we are with Joe working on the central fountain piece. We get a good sense of the scale of it by this. The photo on the right is seeing the work in progress, and then on the left is as it is installed. And again, we've got the bronze piece of the indigenous people. Clearly, Father Sarah's impacted their community by the way they're dressed. Then we have the pioneer explorers on the right. And that's 2 of 8 depictions that if you walked around that piece, you would be able to see. And the interesting thing about this piece is if you look at the top portion, those are clearly Hopi designs. And Joe lived with the Hopi and the Navajo for almost 3 years. And it's the one departure from California history that he dares to make on this particular building, where he includes those motifs there that were deep in his heart, and I think he probably just couldn't help himself. And there again is another shot of the building. And this is what it looks like from the exterior, a little bit more of a detail of that portion. And you can see the heads as they go down, and they wrap around 3 sides of the building and the interior courtyard. So there's actually 6 different surfaces where you see the heads. And the building just recently went through a major retrofit, but they did a fantastic job of maintaining its integrity. It's set to last for another 100 years. And nothing compromised any of the artwork that Joe had done. And then we move a little further south in Monterey County to the King City High School Auditorium. And this was the second project that Robert Stanton and Joe Mora worked on together. This was the King City High School Auditorium, which is still in use today. This is a vintage photograph of it, but at some point it was designed to be the high school auditorium and was used that way. But it's in the years since, it has taken on a much more meaningful place in the community. It's used for community theater, it's used for meetings. It really is a focal point in King City. And again, if you look to the left area and you look near the top of those columns, there are similar but different motifs. And then the front of the building over on the right side, we will see another detail of, hopefully. And I apologize. There we go. And so this is the front of the building. And again, Joe, there's a major departure here for him as far as the artistic depiction is concerned. And here he celebrates the arts. And it starts in the top left with dance. The center panel at the top is a celebration of movie making. There's drama as a motif. There's music as a motif. And then again, in the bottom in the center, he goes back to his time with the Hopi. But this has there's different cultures depicted here. There's Hindu and Egyptian. There's this ode to medieval times. So it's a celebration of the arts and culture in this case. And in fact, the top of the columns, we see the drama masks, comedy and tragedy. So it's totally fitting for a building that's going to be used as a theater and with a massive stage and stuff. So I love, and this was about 2 years later that they did this. Yeah. A little bit of a close-up. And here we have a scene of Joe in his studio, again, working on these. And he would start with clay, and then they would cast that, and it would eventually be cast again to make a mold, and then it would be cast in a concrete-like material, which is what's actually on the building. And the image here on the right is the clay version of the image that's actually on the building. And here we have, I mentioned remembering those bronze plaques. The doors of the auditorium initially had designs on them in bronze as well. And those doors have since disappeared, the bronze versions, but we do have the drawings that Joe made. So you get, assuming that assuming I can show them to you. There were 6 drawings too, and again, representing different forms of, here we go. Pretty curious to see a clown like that, but and a close-up of a couple of the column caps, just to give you an idea. Again, continuing, you notice there's a ballerina on the left. So again, continuing with the arts. And I'm just gonna go forward to the end of the PowerPoint. And I apologize for the technical snafus. I can't explain it. But now it's time to turn the floor over to Harvey Smith. And here we go.
Okay, thank you so much, Peter, for the presentation. I do want to point out to everybody, though, that this is just a small fraction of Joe Mora's work that we've looked at. We got in front of me, and I recommend to everybody the book that Peter has written, and it's 300 pages. And what we covered with the two projects in Monterey County is really about 1/50th of what's written in the book. The one part of it that really grabs me is at the very beginning, which is kind of the coming of age story of Joe Mora, where he strikes out from the East Coast, becomes a working cowboy in California, and then literally goes by horse and buggy to Arizona to live with the Hopi. So it's a fascinating story, and there's just a lot more in the book. So I really recommend to everybody to take a look at the book. Just to get going with some questions, I don't know if the questions are okay. I see a couple in the Q&A now. Okay, so good, or at least one. So we'll get to those shortly. So let me just open up with a few questions. One is that I'd kind of like to know how you came to Joe Mora. I came to Joe Mora through his cowboy artwork and then the New Deal. But what grabbed your interest about Joe and got you to the point where you're really invested in sharing his legacy with people?
Well, thank you for asking that question. My wife and I moved up to the Monterey Peninsula in 1981. We escaped from Los Angeles, and I came up here to be employed as an art teacher in elementary and middle school. So that's my background. That's my vocation for almost 40 years, was teaching art. And the longer we lived here, the more we accidentally would run into the work of Joe Mora. And it really initially was kind of accidental. I found two posters of his in a drawer at the school where I worked. We stumbled upon a menu he had designed at the Trail and Saddle Club in Carmel Valley at a Western event. So slowly but surely I was seeing his work. And what I was continually enamored with was the quality of his work and the variety of mediums that he worked in. And so as an art teacher, I'm thinking, well, this man can do it all. He does it all well. And the subject matter resonates with me. I grew up with Hopi and Navajo cultural material in my house. I still have it to this day. It's still, deep in my heart. And so there were just all of these sort of series of events. And I finally got to the point where I knew enough to realize that there's more that I can't see. I was seeing the ephemeral material, but I wasn't seeing the sculptures necessarily. And so I proposed a museum exhibit at the Monterey Museum of Art. They said yes very quickly. And so for 2 years while I was teaching, I was also curating an exhibit that took place in the summer of 1998. And it was a wonderful excuse for knocking on doors, asking people to share their collections, finding and discovering new things, and going, to trading posts and Hubble's trading post in Ganado, Arizona, and different places, and gathering this all up. And people were consistently willing to loan their treasures and their collections. And so it was a wonderful exhibit. And it broke attendance records at the time, but it didn't satiate my interest. I mean, I knew there was more, and I have continued to be fascinated with him and dedicated to getting the word out about him in the spirit of what his son used to do. And that's been for more than 25 years now, and I have not totally scratched the itch.
Okay. it's actually, fascinating that these two projects, what they represent, because we're not talking about a big city like San Francisco or even a smaller city, say like Berkeley, that has New Deal projects, but we're talking about the Salinas Valley, a courthouse in Salinas, and then this auditorium in King City. And it's kind of amazing that these cities got these incredibly beautifully artistically adorned buildings. And I think a comment about the New Deal, about how every place deserves to have beautiful art and beautiful architecture. But it's also, I guess, a comment on this collaboration between Robert Stanton and Joe Mora. You want to say anything about that?
Well, I totally agree. And I think they were far enough in each of their own careers that they were trusted with the projects like that. And the timing was perfect in terms of when the New Deal was evolving. And both those communities needed that kind of a shot in the arm in terms of the growth that was taking place. And you're right, I think they are two buildings. I refer to the courthouse as the building that speaks, because it just tells so many stories. And the auditorium really does as well, celebrating the arts. So they were a perfect mixture of the artistic component that the New Deal required, and then the community focus that both those buildings provided. They met the needs of the New Deal perfectly. And I agree, there's a lot of cities much larger than Salinas and King City that don't have buildings that are that significant in their community. So it was just a wonderful series of events, I think.
And kind of makes you reflect on today, where most of what we see going up in our urban environment are these glass and steel boxes. Yeah. I think we've kind of forgotten that architects and artists can collaborate and make something truly beautiful. Yeah. There was a technical question about the work, and what material were leaves done in their permanent application to the building?
Well, as best as I know, it was a concrete-like material. And Stanton was the courthouse, and I haven't read this about the auditorium, but the courthouse was actually had a component of reinforced rebar in it. And so it met, it came very close to meeting current earthquake standards. So there was some new technology, I think, that went into that building. And but by and large, most of the work was concrete. Joe had to figure out how to actually set the heads into the building, which he did with a notch in the back of the sculpted part that would fit into a groove in the building. So it was like a peg going into a hole. But he had the wherewithal in order to do that. And the actual building engineer was quoted as saying he never had a more fulfilling experience working with someone on a building than he did working with Joe. So I thought that spoke very highly of Joe.
The work, I think, is incredible in the sense that the New Deal is known a lot for its Art Deco architecture. That wasn't the only style, but that's sort of the key style. And yet you have this combination of the Deco in Stanton's design, but then you very kind of a classical style with Joe Mora. And it's an interesting, because his style was certainly not the kind of typical flowing Deco look. It's different than what was sort of the prevailing style at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Was Mora, and we have a question, was Mora in touch with Maynard Dixon and some of the other artists, famous cowboy artists of the period?
Yes. And a lot of that goes back to Joe's membership in the Bohemian Club in San Francisco. Joe knew when he came west that that was something he wanted to pursue, was membership in the club, and it ended up being a really important component of his career, because he met people who not only did he end up in some cases working with, but also other people who became benefactors. And so there was a financial component that enriched his life. And so that was probably the venue where that developed. But he did communicate with Maynard Dixon. I have record of letters between the two of them, not as much as I would like, but they did stay in touch. Joe knew the art community in the Monterey Peninsula. He was neighbors with Ferdinand Bergdorf, who actually did some WPA artwork, and they were neighbors and friends. So he was aware of the community. He, I think, needed to spend so much time working that he didn't necessarily socialize, and he didn't necessarily record that part of his life. He was more focused on being a father and a husband and working, to pay the bills, than he was in gallivanting around and with the other artists. But he was, and interestingly, throughout his career, he avoided what I call the isms. He was very aware of the world around him. He traveled around the world literally on a steamship, and he had a really good sense of what was going on in Paris, for example, at the turn of the century. But yet he avoided all those in terms of his own work, and he stayed true to kind of his classical art upbringing. And that style really held true throughout his whole career.
As you pointed out, the courthouse, most of the artwork is in the courtyard. And I visited there a couple of times, and it was just open. You could just go into the courtyard. But is that still true with the renovation, that anyone is free to observe the work in the courtyard?
Yes, it is still available to the public. There now is a small cafe that's called Joe's Cafe, and in there are some murals and examples of Joe's work. And there's also in the East Lobby, there's a history display of the building, those are new additions within the last year or so. So I'm not sure how long ago it was that you were there, but they're good reason to go back. So, but yes, it is generally open to the public. As with any public building right now, someone might walk up to you and ask you what you're doing, but if you say you're looking at the building, I think that's reason enough for them to let you continue to do so.
Joe Mora's work, I think for many people, or especially people of the 60s generation, they're familiar with his work because it was adapted for an album cover by the Byrds, Sweetheart of the Rodeo. And I'm just wondering how did that come about? And it was actually after Joe's passing, so I guess years after his death. So how did that actually happen? Do you know?
Well, my guess, and the story that I tell, is that it goes to Chris Hillman, who was the bass player for the Byrds. And Chris is also a cowboy, and he actually rides horseback and ropes to this day, as well as continuing to be a musician. And so I have a feeling that he was the one who was, aware of Joe's work, and it was particularly Joe's Sweetheart of the Rodeo poster that probably had come to his attention. And so I think what happened, Columbia Records published or printed the record. They got in touch with Joe Jr., who was still at that time working as his dad's business manager and granting rights to different proposals, things. And they came to Joey and asked about doing it and paid nicely. and Joey agreed. And what I've always appreciated is that on the back of the album, it says illustration by Joe Mora, which doesn't always happen, but they acknowledge that. And so that's my sense. I do know the Columbia Records part of it, that's true. And they came to Joey, they asked permission to rearrange the image to fit the square format, which all that was good as far as Joey was concerned. So I do think that Chris Hillman was probably the linchpin there.
We have a question about where can people find a list so that they can see other works by Joe Mora. And again, I recommend your book is probably a very good source for that. But is there something online that people can consult?
There is. Well, there is a list in the book, and that same list is available online at joemoratrust.com. And if you look around enough, you will find a list of Joe's work in public places. And it's a pretty good list, pretty complete, of Joe's work across the United States. And a lot of it is in California, but there's some in other states as well. And so that is the easiest way to find a good list, eat that or buy the book. So,
and where's the best place to buy the book?
Any place good books are sold. There's even some used copies on eBay.
Okay, great. Was a question about Joe Mora's house and studio. Is it still standing?
Yes, it is still standing. It is lovingly cared for and lived in by a family since the Moras. They have converted the workshop studio area into their living room. So the basic outline footprint of the house remains the same. And initially the house was studio and then kitchen area and living quarters as kind of wings with the studio in the middle. And the building's, again, footprint still remains the same. Its use has just changed. And it's, I should also point out that the family that lives there very much appreciates where they live, that it was Joe Mora's house. They have a little display of Joe Mora artwork in their house. So it's in very good hands.
Well, speaking of being in good hands, could you tell us something about your role as curator of the Joe Mora Trust and Collection?
Well, what I do, I often feel like and hope that I'm carrying on in Joe Mora Jr.'s footsteps with, trying to look after his dad's legacy and bring his work to the attention of a larger public audience. I feel like you'd asked earlier about some other Western artists, and certainly Frederick Remington and Charlie Russell are, probably the two names, the Maynard Dixon you mentioned, that come to mind so quickly when you think of Western artists. And I feel like Joe Mora's name should be just as familiar to the public. And slowly but surely, I hope it's getting there. But I will just keep kicking until something national happens, I guess. That's what I keep thinking, is that just something national needs to happen. Even if it's a segment on the Sunday morning show or something on CBS. I actually approached Ken Burns a number of years ago about a documentary, because I thought that would be a great way to get the word out about him. And he wrote back and he said, well, I really think that's an interesting idea, but I'm busy for the next 20 years. So that put an end to that one, but something. So if there's filmmakers out there, documentary filmmakers that are interested, I am always all ears.
Father Sarah has become, in very recent times, a controversial character in art history in California. Yet back in the day when Joe Mora was living in Carmel, he actually was, he worked on sculpting an ornamental tomb for Father Sarah. Can you talk a little bit about that project? Well,
he did. And this was actually the project that brought Joe from the Bay Area down to the Monterey Peninsula, where the family moved down there at the time in 1920. And that's where they stayed for the rest of their lives. And it was because Joe had been given a commission to do a cenotaph in honor of Father Sarah, to be located on the grounds of the Carmel Mission. And Joe approached it in all seriousness, and it's a monumental piece of sculptural work. It's a combination of travertine marble and bronze. It again has historic motifs. There's different panels depicting the history of California, and he starts with the indigenous people. And it's a magnificent kind of European style sculptural piece that is visited by people to this day. And Joe was a person who, as we mentioned briefly, lived with the Hopi and the Navajo. His heartstrings were always with the indigenous people in this country. And I think, it's just hard to look at this in today's lens without knowing what Joe's response would be. But at the time, for him, it was a great honor. Joe's father was Catalan, so so there was a heritage that was similar to Father Sarah's. That's where his lineage went back, or in fact himself included. So I think Joe looked at it as an honor to have been asked to do this piece. And he also did a second one that was in a public place in Carmel, another statue of Father Sarah that he did for S.F.B. Morris, who developed the Hotel Del Monte and then went on to develop Pebble Beach. That piece has actually been removed. So we do have this current day reaction to the subject matter of Joe's work. And no one ever took issue with the artist, but they did, at the city of Carmel and the county at some point were concerned that public Father Sarah would be vandalized. So they've taken it down, put it in storage, and now they're deciding what to do because it was part of a sort of an installation that Joe created around it. So it's an interesting question, but the cenotaph, Joe considered to be probably his single most important commission in his career.
Well, Joe Mora's life spanned this incredible period. I mean, he was from the horse and buggy days to, through jet travel. So can you tell a little bit about that California that Joe first came to? Because I think we think of him more, from particularly the New Deal work. He's kind of a modern artist, but he really got here at a much earlier time.
Well, he did. He first got to California in 1903. And so the story that resonates about California is, at the time, and in the beginning of 1904, he was living in the San Ynez Valley, which is just over the mountains from Santa Barbara. And he was living on a ranch. He was learning the vaquero horseman ways, acquiring knowledge that would factor in his artwork for the rest of his career. But he was intending to go to Arizona, and he had some time before he was going to set off to do that. And what he did then was he took his horse. He had bought a horse when he came west. He put it on a boat in Santa Barbara, sailed down to San Diego. They turned around and got off, and he rode horseback by himself with his saddlebags, with one of the first Kodak cameras, with watercolor paints and paper and a blank journal. And he rode, and his bedroll, and he rode the El Camino Real from Santa Barbara up to San Juan Bautista. And so, this journal he kept is meticulous, but he rarely saw anybody else on the road. So imagine following what is basically Highway 101 from San Diego up to San Juan Bautista today, compared to when Joe did it on horseback and saw virtually nobody else on the trail. And he was following Crespi's diary from the Portola expedition. And he felt like he was actually finding campsites from the 1700s when they had done that expedition. So, you know, he saw the original California, if you will. And I think that just, you know, he stayed here for the rest of his life. So I think it really resonated with him. So.
Yeah, we're just about at the end here, and I just want to one maybe brief reply to this one, because it's one of those mysteries I love, a New Deal mystery. What happened to the bronze doors on the courthouse? Any theories on that one?
Well, I've talked to several people in King City, and the courthouse is all intact. The auditorium in King City, those doors were replaced at some point, and I've even talked to maintenance men, and nobody knows where they are. So I don't know if, I don't know. I never say never in terms of trying to find something like that. But so far their location is unknown.
Okay. Well, in closing, I just wondered if you have anything else you want to add, and then what's the best way for people to find contact information for you if they have further questions?
You know, well, that same website, joemoratrust.com, you can get to me through that. And more than anything else, thank you very much for having me. And I apologize dearly for the technical snafus. I don't understand them yet, but thank you for your patience, and thank you for having me.
So I just want to thank both of you. What a fantastic presentation and wonderful questions from our audience, and want to thank our interviewer, Harvey Smith. Why don't you put in the chat the best way for people to get in touch with you, because there's been a lot of messages of people who are interested in perhaps having you speak at their organizations. But I just want to, I'm looking at the chat now, there's just everybody saying, thanks so much. Truly wonderful. Thanks so much. So people are really, really grateful for the lessons of Joe Mora and what you presented today. And I just want to, again, thank you both for just a wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you. And I tried to put my email address in there, so I hope that.
Yeah, we can see it.
Oh, good. Okay.
And just as a reminder, we have like 4 more scheduled webinars coming up about diverse artists and cultures who were funded, benefited in complex relationship with the New Deal. And next month, we have a wonderful presenter, author Jennifer McLaren, who wrote a book about the New Deal and Native American art. That's going to be coming up on the, I can't remember. I think the 24th of February. But you can check our website, livingnewdeal.org, to find out more about that one. And if you'd like to get these invitations direct to your email box, just get in touch with us and we'll add you to the list. Thanks everybody for being part of today's conversation, and we look forward to seeing you at future webinars.
See you all next time.